I'm Bill Auten of Auten Claims Management.
I'm Chantal Roberts of CMR Consulting, and welcome to the Art of Adjusting podcast.
Today, we're going to talk about life as an insurance adjuster from the perspective of property, auto, liability, or workers' compensation adjusters. Our goal is to bring interesting topics in the world of claims adjusting to people who are working as an adjuster now and to people who are considering a career as a claims adjuster. Right on. Did you turn the microphone on, Chantal?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
It looks like we're ready to go.
Yay.
How you doing, Chantal? Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. How are you?
Pretty good. And today we're going to talk about something really fun, liability and negligence.
Yes.
Yay. That's
Yay.
the world I live in.
Yeah, I always liked liability claims. And I remember a lot of my adjusters were always very frightened, I guess, of liability, and they liked property damage better. And I think it's simply because you're dealing with a third party in that particular instance with liability. But I said, well, ironically, you don't mind doing cargo claims, and cargo is a liability claim. Nah, so I mean, you're just not dealing with bodily injury. Anyway,
Right.
that's my story.
Well, the other part about liability claims that people tend to not like is the fact that there are not hard numbers around things all the time.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the value of a broken leg or a broken wrist, that could be different for different people.
Yes.
And you can quantify medical expenses and lost wages and extra expenses and all the hard numbers. But when it comes to the general damages and the actual pain and suffering number, we don't have a book for that or a chart for that or a calculator for that, do we?
No, and I will say, just interjecting before I forget, if I don't say it later on, for all the adjusters out there, and I don't think we hear it much anymore, but back in the day when dinosaurs still roamed the earth and I was writing on clay tablets and we moved up to papyrus because that was the new hip thing.
Right. And then
um
digital cameras came out.
yeah. All of the claimants and the claimants attorneys, they all said, oh, three times meds, blah blah blah. And I haven't heard that phrase in quite some time, but it's been a while since I've handled a liability bodily injury case. But I just wanted to insert it real quick that three times meds is not how we settle our general damages or the bodily injury aspect of the claim.
Not really. And there's no science, there's no mathematical formula for it.
Mm-mm.
In most cases, like here in New York, there's always a demand right up front
Mm.
to disclose policy limits. And that usually governs the scope of the demand,
Mhm.
which is laughable in many cases because you're talking about a case that's not worth policy limits and you have $1 million limit and they automatically go for the policy limits and it's just not there. And it's not, and we know it's not valued at the policy limits because we settle so many of these and we know, a range of where it should be,
Right.
that we have a pretty good guess. And we can make recommendations to our client as an independent adjuster. We can make recommendations when asked for them by our clients, and we'll give them a range. And if they don't like it, then they can say, well, that sounds too high, and we think we can get it done for less. So here's your authority. And we'll see if we can negotiate it within that. Now, we're talking about liability and negligence today, not damages. We should probably earmark damages for a whole other conversation, but
Yes.
and I bifurcate them in my brain. I do damages on one side and I do liability on the other.
Hmm.
And I always try and figure the damages first because I want to know worst case scenario.
Hmm.
And then I go through and calculate, okay, what's the comparative negligence or the contributory negligence on the part of the person who got injured? Did they participate in this injury at all themselves that would reduce the liability of the defendant? So anyway, that's how I approach liability and damages. Um, and since we're focusing on negligence and liability, why don't we take a look at the whiteboard?
The handy dandy whiteboard.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So do you want to introduce your handy dandy whiteboard? Because I like it. I love it.
Sure. So they are the four elements of negligence. You have a duty, and what that means is that you have a duty to maintain a safe premises, or to not hurt somebody else, or to not be an idiot.
Mhm.
You have a duty to, stay on your side of the road, and when you're driving, you have a duty to obey traffic stop signals and things like that.
So you have a duty to act or not act as a reasonable person would or
Right.
would not do, basically.
Right.
And it goes back to that reasonable person test, which of course we
Yes.
all know that that reasonable person is going to be a jury member. Like
Right.
what would the jury do? What would the jury think? Because that's supposed to be a nice swath of our um, population.
Yep. And and once you've established that there is a duty that is owed by the defendant to the general public or the person who got hurt, then you have to say, well, did they breach that duty? And if they did, if they ran that stop sign, or if they, didn't take care of their property the way they should have to make it safe, then they breached their duty to the public. Again, using the reasonable person standard. And then if they did breach that duty, did that cause the incident to happen? So there's got to be a causal relationship. So that's the C over there. So we
Right.
got A, B, and C. C is the causal relationship between the breach of their duty and the incident that, alleged to have caused injuries or damages. And that leads to the last one, which is D, and that's damages. So damages have to result. So if you ran a stop sign and somebody else had to put their brakes on really fast, but no collision occurred, they just got really mad,
Mhm.
there's not really any damages there, so there's no claim. But
Right.
if they hit you because you ran the stop sign and they messed up their front bumper, then or worse, then we do have damages as a result of the duty, the breach of the duty, and the causal relationship. And there you go.
Yeah.
Those are the elements. So when you have any negligence case, always run it through this test and these four elements. And if one of those elements is missing, then you don't really have a negligence claim, a valid negligence claim.
So can I take it back one more step though?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that it actually took me probably a good 5 years, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but on the flip side, I do want to admit it, and I do talk about it because it's one of those things where, it's like you learn from people admitting
Mhm.
their mistakes and
Yeah.
and what have you. So it I think it actually took me a good 5 years to figure out that there's kind of like a two-part test with liability claims versus a property damage claim. With your property damage claim, what you're looking at is solely the policy, and you're looking solely at, is there coverage? Yes, then you pay the covered claim. Is there not coverage? No, then you don't pay the claim. You would send out a denial. It's just a yes, no kind of thing, and it only deals with the policy. However, with liability claims, there's kind of a quote unquote two-part test where you first have to look at coverage. Is there coverage? Yes or no. If there's coverage, then you go on to liability and you run down these four ABCD things. And what I think a lot of our consumers don't understand, and we as the insurance industry or as adjusters maybe fail to explain well, is that it is perfectly plausible for an insured, and this is usually what happens for an insured, a policyholder, to have coverage but not be negligent, liable, at fault, whatever word you want to use. It is equally possible, and this is where I think consumers have a really hard time understanding it, is it's equally possible for there not to be coverage, but the insured be negligent, liable, at fault. And I think that is really hard for a consumer to understand. I mentioned this because as an adjuster, we would need to explain that. And it took me, like I said, a good probably 5 years to realize how these things kind of fit together, how these cogs fit together, that it's possible for one trigger to be tripped, but not the other one.
Right.
So that's the reason why I mentioned this. I'm embarrassed that it took me that long, but maybe I'll say someone else that embarrassment.
Yeah, that's an easy thing to get tripped up on because, and I think especially if you're used to the realm of first party claims, because you're dealing with coverage and then how much is the claim worth.
Mhm.
Whereas in liability claim, you're looking at coverage for sure. Then you're looking at liability, whose fault it was, and then you're looking at damages.
Right.
And you're right, you can have coverage and no liability. You can
Mhm.
have liability and no coverage.
Mhm.
And one scenario is a lot worse than the other for the policyholder. So, um, and actually, there's a lot to talk about with both those scenarios. And one of them is if you've got liability and no coverage, that gets to be problematic.
It does, because as an adjuster, you not only have to send out a letter to the claimant saying, "Hey, there's no coverage for this." You don't quote policy language to them, but you say there's no coverage. But you also need to do a declination letter to your insured, and you do need to quote your policy language on that.
Yeah. And here in New York, we just carbon copy the actual disclaimer.
Mm,
The coverage rules are so bizarre here that we basically got to turn over every policy to the plaintiff. We have to actually,
you-
when there's a suit, there's a new rule that came up a year and a half ago, that when a matter is placed in suit, that a disclosure has to be made about all of the policies that are available to that policyholder, whether or not they apply.
Yeah, but I mean, you don't know everything. Okay, it's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, yeah,
California has something similar, and
yeah,
so I guess we should go ahead and say we're talking very generally
yeah, yeah, yeah.
in regards to what you can and can't share with a third party claimant.
Yeah, check your state laws
Yeah.
if you are in the business of writing disclaimers and denial letters.
Mm,
Make sure you're checking with your supervisors on what should go out and how it should be written and all that.
yeah.
But the point of bringing that the no coverage issue up is that there's a very basic benefit available to policyholders under the liability coverage. There's two components to it. One of them is indemnity, where the policy pays to pay on your behalf
Hmm.
damages that you owe to somebody else, and the other is defense. And
Yeah.
your insurance company will pay for attorneys to uh, provide a rigorous defense to you in order to prevent um, any undesirable outcomes in terms of verdicts or things like that. So without those two benefits, if you don't have coverage, now you've got to go hire your own attorney.
Mm,
And if there's a verdict against you, you've got to pony up the dough for it. So
mhm. And also, for adjusters, what this means is this is when you hear your manager or more senior adjusters muttering around the office, the duty to defend is broader than the duty to indemnify.
yes, yes,
So even if there's no coverage or the allegations in the lawsuit are absolutely frivolous. What a good plaintiff attorney does is plead to some kind of scintilla, just, I mean, like the barest hair's width of kind of coverage kind of thing. I mean, like negligence of supervision or something. I mean, just something, anything that
something,
they can hook onto with that policy, even if they have that disclaimer letter, so that they can at least start making the insurance company pay, because, quote, the duty to defend is broader than the duty to indemnify. And what that again means is, just like what Bill said, is we as the insurance carrier then owe a rigorous defense to the policyholder, which also leads to a whole nother kit and caboodle of funness, is if there is a coverage question and there's a lawsuit, you would oftentimes have to send out a reservation of rights letter. Once you do that, you have opened yourself up to Mueller or Mueller Council or Coomis Council. Mueller's in Mississippi, Coomis is in California. I think other states have other things, but if you just call them one of those things, your attorney's going to know what you're talking about. Which means that you, as the insurance company, have the fun fact, joy of paying for a second attorney to defend the insured, and then you need to go ahead and bifurcate your file too. And
And this
that's
is
just
for a coverage, in case there's a coverage dispute.
well, yes, if since we were still talking, since we were still concentrating on there not being coverage or there being a coverage question in a, in a liability or policy, something like that, then yes, we need to make sure there's certain states that believe you aren't going to be representing the insured correctly or fully if you think that there's a coverage question. Like, I don't think there's coverage, so I'm not going to tell the attorney to do XYZ.
Right.
So what, like Mississippi and California, what they do is they say, no, you insurance company have the duty to provide an attorney. You have to give the insured an attorney that's only for them. That attorney is going to be reporting to a completely separate, or they should be reporting to a completely separate adjuster. So y'all can't talk. And that's when you do get a coverage file and a defense file and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, and the phrase
That's
that we are familiar with here is the tripart,
tripartite.
tripartite relationship between
Yeah.
the defense attorney and the policy holder
Mhm.
is separate. Even though they're being paid by the insurance company, you can't use that attorney to make a coverage decision. So,
No.
we always recommend that they use separate counsel for coverage issues and separate counsel for defense. And you are correct. If feasible and possible, the coverage issues should be handled by a different adjuster within the company, and they should not discuss the issues unless there is an actual declination of coverage. Then they can communicate loudly and clearly about that.
Yeah, so we've kind of gotten, I wouldn't say really off course because this is still all about our
It's a
liability. And
messy, it's a
it
messy business, isn't it?
and I think that's one of the reasons why those of us who love it. And those people who hate it because it can get messy. I like it. I like getting
Mhm.
down in the dirt and the mud and going through all of that. I think that part is fun. Now what you had said is that you feel that the damages is something separate. And maybe this is true because I know like the institutes, for example, that's CPCU, AIC, all of them, they usually only preach the ABC rule, which is a duty, a breach of duty, and the proximate cause of the accident. Like is the breach the cause of the accident, the proximate cause of the accident, like an unbroken chain of events. I've always put D in there for damages because I believe D is part of it.
It
Um,
is absolutely it is.
I think that that's part of it. I was wondering if we wanted to talk about negligence versus liability kind of deal. Negligence is more of like that legal term, quote unquote. I'm doing air quotes on YouTube. You can't see it on the radio. So there you go. If you're listening to the podcast, but
Who
negligence
listens
is,
to a radio?
I don't know. Oh my gosh. Okay. So side story real quick, just side story. So I was getting my hair done one time at the salon and I ended up not using them, but you know what I'm talking about. You try out all these salons. I mean, you
Oh
have
yeah, I'm
hair,
there
you
all
know
the
what I'm
time.
talking about.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I was at this salon, and the owner was just singing just as loud as he could be, off key, all of this kind of stuff. But I mean, happened at the time of his life. And it was like this 80s song. And I was like, yeah, this takes me back, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, a commercial comes on. And
Mhm.
I'm like, are we actually listening to the radio? Because it was a local commercial, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, we are actually listening to the radio. Who listens to the radio?" Yeah. So,
Well, barbers who sing 80s songs, listen to them.
yes, obviously, yes. So, anywho, there you go.
Well,
Uh,
back to your discussion about damages, and just to clarify, I don't mean that damages should not be part of this discussion,
yeah,
but how we calculate damages, it could be a whole nother
it
podcast.
could be. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that would be good. It probably should be our next one, even though we already have it planned out, but that's
Yeah.
okay. It's not like we can't move things.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, where was I going? Okay, right there. So negligence is more of a legal term, whereas liability, I think, is more of the casual term. And I just bring this up simply because I get told as an expert witness, hey, don't mention quote unquote negligence unless you can define it. And I never can really define it, except to say that it is what a reasonable person would or would not do. Now, whether that's the actual legal definition, I have no idea, but that's also what I consider to be liability. And so, what I tell my students is, because insurance is confusing, we have liability as in at fault, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about liability, but we also have
Right.
liability policies. And so I said, just because I don't want to confuse everybody, I will maybe use the word negligence or negligent, or at fault, rather than liable or liability, because I don't want to have people get confused between one policy versus, if I'm talking about if someone is breaching a duty that was a proximate cause of the damages. Yeah, just FYI.
It's interesting because to be liable for something doesn't necessarily mean you're negligent. You can be liable by contract
Yeah.
because you made a promise that made you liable for something to do something. So, in that respect, liability and negligence aren't necessarily always interchangeable. But if you are negligent, you become liable for damages. So,
Yeah. This is a good point, because I also started talking to my students about strict liability.
mhm,
And, I mentioned, when would we have strict liability, or when would we have, res ipsa loquitur, which is the thing speaks for itself, or when would we have respondeat superior, which is let the master answer. And I had just recently written an article about respondeat superior and vicarious, like, not necessarily vicarious liability, but the strict liability that you're responsible for your children,
mhm,
when it comes to the actions that your children do. You'll also see this a lot in cars, for example. Like, if you loan your car to someone that is, a drunk or DUI or whatever, they get into an accident, you could also be at fault for that accident.
sure.
Whereas you are at fault for someone else's actions. And
Employers and employees.
yes, and that's where you usually see that respondeat superior come in. But the article that I was talking about was the Crumleys and the mass shooting that went on in Wisconsin, I think it was, or Michigan, where the parents were found guilty of manslaughter because they were responsible for their child's
Right.
act.
Very interesting case.
It is a very interesting case, and I kind of feel like everybody in insurance, or at least people who handle liability claims, would kind of saw it coming, because we already knew that parents are responsible for their children. And I just selfish plug also talk about that in the book with The Ugly Duckling, which is what the article was about how bullying um, is something that tweens and teenagers do, and we can't say anymore, oh, that's just kids being kids or whatever. No, you got to shut that down as a parent, because you could be liable for, or you could be at fault, or you could be negligent for, that, or maybe not, because it is an intentional act.
I remember a seminar I went to in had to be 2001 or 2002,
Mm.
long time ago. And it was on emerging risks. And one of them was cyberbullying and the liabilities that could attach to parents for the actions of their kids online. At that point, 2002, it
Mhm.
was fairly early on. There was not I don't even think Facebook was a thing yet.
Yeah.
We had MySpace and what else did we have? Radios.
Yeah, radios, obviously. We were singing along with the radio, off key, obviously.
Yeah. But
Um,
kids were still texting with old fashioned phones, the old
mhm,
Nokias. They were still able to text and get into trouble that way.
yeah.
But boy, has the landscape changed since 2002. And I don't see a lot of claims involving cyberbullying in my world, but that doesn't mean that they're not out there. I'm sure they are.
Yeah, the ones that I have seen um a- aren't necessarily quote unquote bullying so much as like, you're ugly or whatever. It would be something like um having pictures taken of you in the changing room, in the locker room, and then sending that out to all the boys.
Yeah.
And so that would probably fall under some kind of cyber issue, cyberbullying or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, anyway, um,
Kids are brutal.
kids are brutal. And I thank God that we were pretty much the last generation that didn't have, uh that wasn't online 24/7. But
Yeah.
that is like actually beside the point. We're still talking about liability. And I guess the thing too is when I'm talking to my kids about liability, at fault, negligence, all of this kind of stuff, and I mentioned the ABCD rule, I say this is the reason why you need to be aware of the fact that just because you slip and fall in a grocery store does not mean the grocery store is at fault.
Right.
You've got to understand that just because you tripped over a crack in the sidewalk does not mean that store or New York City or whomever is at fault, even if their job is to take care of that sidewalk. You as the pedestrian or you as the claimant also have a duty.
Duty.
You
That's right.
also can't breach that duty, which is to walk clear across the, pavement or busy street on your phone, not paying any attention or, something like that. One of the examples that I gave to the kids that they, were like, what? Yeah, it kind of like blew their little mind is I said, okay, let's say we have a car and that car is making a left-hand turn and you are coming towards that car. And I said, whose fault is it if y'all have a collision? And they said automatically it's the left-hand turner, right? Because they turned in front. And I said, well, let's think about this. How far back were you? If you're far enough back that you could have avoided the accident, there's a thing called last chance.
Last clear chance.
You had the
Yep.
last clear chance to avoid the accident. Just because someone turned in front of me doesn't mean I continue to go 55 miles an hour and hit him because I
Right.
had the right of way or I'm going straight and he's turning left.
You might want to.
Yes, you might want to. Don't get me wrong. Now, if he turns right in front of you when you're like 3 feet away, of course.
Yeah. If you don't have time to actually physically apply your brake, that's
Exactly.
different.
Yes. And it's the same thing for rear ending and all of these sorts of things. So while we are confusing all of the adjusters who are listening by going over, this ABCD rule, and now we're spitting out all of these possibilities or these defenses for liability. It can be a complicated little beast, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's fun. And you're right, we haven't even begun talking about uh damages yet.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, that whole discussion I think should be a separate discussion because it entails a lot. But as to, I've got an example that will cover the ABCD
Okay,
in a little more detail, and then I want to talk about trespassers and licensees and
let's
invitees.
talk about that.
All right.
I have a story.
Okay, let's do the example,
Okay.
the last example to demonstrate the ABCs. And it has to do with the age-old claim where a tree falls from one yard onto the neighbor's garage next door.
Hmm.
I've handled hundreds of these in my day. And it doesn't always come down this way, but many, many times the person whose garage got hits will say to the neighbor, well, it's your tree, it's on your property, and it damaged my garage. Therefore, your insurance company should pay for it, not mine. Now, the problems with that are, well, first of all, we have to establish whether or not that tree was a problem and that the insured knew about it. And that's the foreseeability that I always talk about. But if it was a purely healthy tree and you had a violent windstorm with 70-mile-an-hour winds that day, and it pushed over a healthy tree onto the neighbor's garage, what duty would the policyholder have in that scenario? They can't go out there and tie off the tree and prevent it from falling during an active windstorm. So there's really no liability against them, even though the tree was on their property and fell onto somebody else's property. They did not have a duty to do anything with that tree that would have prevented it from fall. They didn't breach the duty. Therefore, if there's no breach, there's no causal relationship. You've got damages, but you don't meet those other three categories. So in that scenario, we don't have liability. That would be a liability denial. The insurance company for the tree owner would defend them to the death in that claim.
Yeah,
And
so I would also say, when you're asking yourself these things, adjusters, A, B, C, D, if there's a no to any of these four, there's no liability.
that's right. That's right.
So yes, the insured had a duty. The duty is not to have your tree fall on your neighbor's yard. Did he breach that duty? No, he actually did not, because it was the tree, it was the wind that pushed this healthy tree over. Now,
We call that an act of God.
yes. Now,
And
even though it was wind and
right,
quote unquote wind would be covered under your property damage, that's property.
that's different.
We're
Yeah.
talking liability. Yeah.
Well, it also does mean is that the owner of the garage would have coverage under his own policy
Yes,
under the
absolutely.
peril of wind.
Yes. And if that's the case, guys, go ahead and file that claim, fix it. And then y'all play subrogation with one another, because the duty of the insurance company is to put our insureds back as they were, or to defend broader than indemnify. So boop,
Yeah.
boop. Look how we're
Yeah.
tying it all together.
Yeah. It's like a big bow.
Yay.
And now, in another scenario, if that tree had been dead and for a long time, and the neighbor with the garage said 6 months earlier, hey, I really wish you would take that tree down because it's perilously close to my garage. And if there's a windstorm, that thing could fall. And the owner of the tree said, yeah, I'll get to it when I get to it. And then the windstorm does come and it falls. That's a different scenario. So if you're investigating that kind of claim, those are the dynamics you need to look for. When you go and inspect a tree, is it full of bugs and termites and rot, or is it a nice healthy tree with green leaves? So anyway, that's a little microcosm of how to approach the questions you need to ask and the decisions you need to make when you're determining liability.
Okay, so off topic slightly.
Okay.
I am an expert at the Big I think I mentioned this previously, and every once in a while we have gotten this question in where the agent will say, my insured neighbor has a dead tree, it's going to fall over one day. The neighbor's not doing anything. What do we do? And so I've always said, write a letter. I mean, good fences make good neighbors, of course. Talk to them first. If they don't want to do anything, write a letter. So that way you have it documented that you did something. But again, if those branches go over your line, you can cut those branches down, Mr. Insured. Doesn't have anything to do with claims per se, but just FYI.
Yeah, dialogue with your neighbors can never hurt as long as everybody's voice is kept at a reasonable level and there are no invectives.
Yeah.
So have a conversation and say, hey, that tree looks pretty ugly, and I'm wondering if you might do something about it. Follow up with a friendly text message. That way you at least have it documented somewhere. And if it continues to go after several attempts to do things like that, then maybe a certified letter with a little more formal language might be warranted. But who knows? I mean, maybe they just don't have the money to do it, and maybe you guys can work something out to get it taken care of, because nobody wants to have to deal with an insurance claim and a fight. So,
No one wants to deal with an insurance adjuster. Not even
well, yeah,
insurance adjusters.
nobody
So
likes us.
mean. Bleh, 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 bleh. Okay. So, was that it?
Trespassers,
Trespassers.
licensees, and invitees.
You want to talk about that?
Sure. So when we talk about the a duty, uh, we can we can now talk about Rapunzel. Oh boy. Oh, I can't wait. I entered your contest. I better win a free one. I
What if I just mail you an autographed copy?
That's fine. I'd be glad to purchase one. Um, how do how do you tie in Rapunzel with Trespasser?
Okay. So guess what? I tie in Rapunzel and Goldilocks with
Oh,
Trespasser because here's Goldilocks. Um,
okay. Oh,
and
she's a trespasser for sure.
well, so is the prince.
She's what?
So is the prince in Rapunzel. So you want me to tell you the story or you want to go first?
No, tell me the story.
Okay. So Rapunzel, right?
Yeah,
We know the story about Rapunzel. The enchantress locks Rapunzel up in the tower
yeah,
and Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair, kind of deal. And so she goes climbing up. Now, in the Brother Grimm version, around the tower, there were some devil's walking sticks, rose bushes, a lot of thorns or whatever. And the prince sees Rapunzel, falls in love, and he goes up and down the tower a couple of times, and the enchantress finds out about it. The prince is a trespasser
yeah.
into the tower. And so when the enchantress chops off Rapunzel's hair, sends her into the desert, and the prince goes up the hair that the enchantress is now using as if she were Rapunzel, and he gets startled and lets go, and then has his eyes clawed out by the devil's walking sticks and the rose bushes thorns, which is kind of gruesome. But we are talking about the Brother Grimm version. What happens is that as a trespasser, the enchantress only owes a duty to the trespasser to notify a trespasser of some kind of hidden problem, some kind of hidden
Right,
trap. They can't lay a trap,
right,
but the prince, he knew that those rose bushes and that had thorns and the devil's walking sticks that had thorns, he knew they were there because he'd been up and down that castle wall or that tower wall 2 or 3 nights in a row, right?
right,
So there's no duty to tell him about it
right,
because he's a trespasser. Now, if let's just say there was an air conditioning guy, and Rapunzel needed her air conditioning fixed or whatever, and the enchantress was letting the air conditioning guy go in, well, then, yeah, she, as the enchantress, would need to tell him about, oh, hey, pay attention to those rose bushes over there. It's got thorns, whatever. Okay. Same thing for Goldilocks. Now, the bears, they're very nice people. They're out fixing themselves some porridge and everything, and they decide to take like their morning constitutional. before they eat and then take their long winter's nap. But Goldilocks is a nosy little girl, and she just like barges into their house while they're not there, eats some porridge, sits on their chairs, rearranges things, takes a nap. And again, I'm using the Brother Grimm version. So the bears wake her up. She's like, "Blah," and jumps out of the second story window, breaks her neck, and dies. Right?
Mm.
Yeah, I know. But the bears are liable, even though Goldilocks is a trespasser, because Goldilocks is a child. They are strictly liable in this particular instance. So, in this particular stories, of course, what I'm talking about is the difference between being a uh, trespasser as an adult and what duties you owe as a landowner or a premises holder or whatever. Do you have a duty? Yeah. You got to keep your premises safe. Did you breach that duty to the trespasser? Nope. Unless that trespasser is a child, so it changes a little bit more.
Yeah.
So that's the stories. Those are the stories.
Very,
It's
very
talk. It's
nice.
coffee
Nice
talk.
tie-in.
It's the coffee talk.
The coffee talk.
It is
So
coffee talk.
when we can talk about trespassers, and everybody knows what a trespasser is, right? They're
Yeah,
somebody that shouldn't be on the property.
exactly.
They wandered on and they shouldn't be there. So it stands to reason for most people that the property owner would owe them the least of the duties of any of the three categories. Now we can move up one duty to the licensee,
Uh-huh.
and that's a person who is on the property with permission, but there's no real direct benefit to them being on the property to the owner. Um, it comes to mind. I'm looking at the park across the way. Anybody go? It's a public park. You can go there. You're not an invitee if you go there. You are a licensee. You can go there and walk through the woods and along the streams and all that. So the duties owed to a licensee are greater than the duties owed to a trespasser,
Mhm.
but probably less than an invitee. Now, an invitee is different because that's a person that might be invited into your store for the purpose of commerce so that you can do business with them. And that would benefit the property owner. So that's an invitee, and you owe a greater care of duty to an invitee than a licensee.
I also have a story
All right.
to distinguish those um,
Yes.
between a licensee and an invitee. Uh,
Yes.
okay, so any person who has traveled, I'm going to be somewhat sexist and say with a woman, we've got smaller bladders. And so we're like always having to stop every 5 minutes to go to the bathroom, right? And so you stop at a gas station and I run in, go to the bathroom. I am a licensee right then and there. I'm a licensee. I'm just using your bathroom. That's all I'm.
Right.
So we leave 5 minutes down the road, like to the very next exit. I got to go to the bathroom again. So I go in, go to the bathroom. I'm still a licensee. The moment I take a right to go get my Diet Coke, I have transitioned into an invitee because I'm going to go buy that Diet Coke. And that is when the owner may need to put out the sign that says wet floor. As a licensee, they're warning me that there's a wet floor, but as an invitee, as soon as I grab that Diet Coke, they're like, hey, there's a wet floor, be careful. They owe me a bigger duty, a grander duty.
Right. And the use of the phrase duty and wet floor in the context of using the bathroom is really twisted me up here, but
Okay,
it's
so I did.
it's the 12-year-old in me. I can't
Oh
help it.
gosh, okay. So again, another story. I have all these British friends, and they always laugh at the way I say duty because it's like
Mhm.
duty. It's like
Duty.
duty. We got a duty, and they're like, and I said, well, then how do you say it? I mean, what's the quote unquote proper way to say duty? And
Duty.
yeah, yeah, they do. It's like duty. It's like Duetee, duty. So anyway, so the
Interesting.
duty is to not have me slip on the floor. There you go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, That's actually a very good example to remember if you're struggling with the difference between an invitee and a licensee. That example is pretty good. If you're going in there just to use the bathroom and leaving, you're a licensee. The minute you become a customer to
Mhm.
purchase something and put some money in the property owner's pocket, then you'll become an invitee.
Now, the where
Very
I
good.
get confused is what about the plumber who comes to my house to fix my, toilet? Because of the duty that
Mhm.
I owe my house guests to have a place to duty.
Yeah. So
Everybody, if you're listening to this, you need to go to YouTube to see Bill's
this is
face right
this is
now.
the 12-year-old version.
Yay, we're having so much
Well,
fun.
I think we've covered the licensees, invitees, and trespassers. I've got one more thing that I'd like to talk about before we wrap up here, and that is negligence per se.
Oh, yeah, very good. Hmm.
And that is when negligence is imposed as a matter of law. So a situation, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but it's the last case where I saw that it was invoked.
Hmm.
And it was a fall downstairs, and they were alleging that there was a code violation of the railing, and that because that railing didn't meet the building code, that was a violation of the law, which I think that's
Mm,
where the problem was, because I think the argument, well, this is a building code, this is not a law.
right.
Either way, they were trying to make the case that it was a negligence per se, that the property owner was negligence as a matter of law, and therefore liability should automatically attach.
A little
Again,
bit different than strict liability, wouldn't you say?
well, in my example, for sure.
Because I
However,
see strict liability usually in dealing with kids, or attractive nuisance or something like that, or in pollution.
product
Products. Mhm.
liability is strict liability, and also here, well, dog bites
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
are
yeah,
strict liability.
yeah.
And I'm not a lawyer, so I can't talk about the tie-in between negligence per se and those types of cases. I think there are laws on the books regarding dog bites, for example, and how liability attaches. So that probably falls into the category of negligence per se.
Mhm.
But basically, what it means is it's just negligence as a matter of law. If you're taking a test, that's what the answer is going to be,
Yeah,
somewhere
there
along
you
those
go.
lines.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think we've covered everything.
Yeah, we nailed it.
We nailed it, dude. Absolutely. So I actually do have something for next week, but I think we should kind of continue, like maybe push that back one and then
Okay,
do damages. Like, how do we determine damages? And by the way, I do have a story about how to determine damages in Once Upon a Claim, Fairy Tales to Protect
really?
Your Assets. Yeah, yeah, because again, the whole point of the book is to explain to consumers that we don't make this stuff up.
Right, right.
I mean, we don't do three times meds. That is actually kind of bad faith because you're just pulling numbers out of
Yeah,
the air. Yeah,
yeah.
and I use a really good example about a person who is DOA who has very little medical bills versus someone who is, I don't know, quadriplegic or something who has big medical bills. The loss of a life is not going to be worth less than a quadriplegic in the same accident or something to that effect. I mean, that makes sense once we start talking about it that way. Um,
And some injuries can be very expensive from a medical standpoint, but not necessarily uh, deep into pain and suffering, where other injuries can be very, very horrendous and difficult processes, healing process, and things like that, where the medical bills might be the same.
mhm,
So when you're looking at pain and suffering and measuring that,
mhm.
it's difficult. There's no formula,
Right.
So
Yeah, so I think okay, so this one is going to come out on April 25th. And so our next one would be May 9th, and I think that we should talk about damages.
All right.
Yeah. What do you think?
Sounds good.
Okay, then we'll
Yeah.
see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. But I have one quick question for you. This
Yes.
mysterious book you keep referencing, when does
Yes.
that come out again?
It actually comes out May 11th. It's a
Oh
Saturday.
boy.
I know it's like right coming up. Yay.
Yeah.
It is coming out May 11th. You can order online through bookstores. If you go to tilting@windmillspress.com, you can um, get a link to indie bookstores because I'm very much into indie bookstores and using the small mom and pop places, but you can get it through Barnes and Noble, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it anywhere. We are going to have the ebook, the hardback book, and an audio book as
An
well.
audiobook. Are you
An
narrating?
No, I am not because I do not have a voice for it, but however, yay. um I have heard one of the stories. I actually heard Rapunzel, and they sent me a little snippet of Rapunzel, and I actually laughed out loud.
Great.
I wrote the book, and of course I wrote jokes in the book. So, and I was hoping people would laugh, but
Great. I can't wait to read it.
yeah. So
So May 11th, that's a Saturday.
it's a Saturday.
So
Yeah,
everybody get on Amazon or your favorite, whatever,
bookstore, Barnes and Noble, whatever. Yeah.
Barnes and Noble,
Mhm.
and order up a bunch of hard copies and give it to all your staff.
There you go. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thanks for joining us on the Art of Adjusting podcast, where we talk about life as an insurance adjuster.
If you enjoyed this podcast or this episode, please give us 5 stars and a review. It does help the algorithm pick us up.
Hit that subscribe button real quick and tell all of your adjuster friends to check this out as well. For independent adjusting services, go to www.auten.claims. And for anyone interested in working as an independent liability adjuster, go to the Contact Us tab to join our roster.
In the meantime, you can contact me at theartofadjusting.com for consulting and training purposes.